Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. We'll give it one more minute as people hop in from that waiting room over and get the webinar started. Okay, we have a good group here, so I do think we will get going in respect for everybody's time. Somehow this became the busiest week of the year. I think when there's that extra week between Thanksgiving and Christmas, people think it's a great time for a meeting. So I really appreciate you taking your lunch here to join us. My name is Allison Bektesh. I am with the Aspen Chamber, and this is the legislative preview session brought to you by the Mountain Chamber Alliance. The Mountain Chamber Alliance has been around for a couple of years now. We created this group to ensure that the mountain communities specifically have a voice on regional and state issues. Our work is to advance public policy goals that enhance economic vitality and then oppose those that negatively impact the communities up here in the mountain region. So along with Aspen, there's also Basalt, Carbondale, Crested Butte, Eagle Chamber, Glenwood Springs, Gunnison, Summit, Steamboat Springs, and Vail Valley. So we have attendees from all across our region here today. Thank you so much for coming, though I know we share a lot of the same issues. There was a time conflict with our state legislators, so I do want to clarify from the bat here that they are not able to join on the preview this time, and we are working to have a check-in with those state senators and representatives later in the session. Who we do get to talk to today, though, is Rachel Beck. She is the executive director of the Colorado Competitive Council with more than 20 years experience in municipal and state government policy work. The Colorado Competitive Council leads a coalition of partners across the state to implement pro-business policy that keeps Colorado competitive. Rachel, if you want to do more of an introduction than that, I will pass it to you and then just remind attendees. Rachel's got a great presentation for what we can expect this upcoming legislative session, particularly how it might affect some business needs and interests. There is a Q&A open that we will be looking at. So feel free to put questions in as they come up and we will address them as they come up. We won't be able to monitor the chat as much, so make sure you get those in the Q&A section. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us and spending the time to put this together.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks for having me, and thank you for putting all of this together. You all represent some of my favorite places to be. It's too bad we can't do this in person, but Zoom is nice for bringing us all together.
Got it.
So as Allison said, we're going to talk about the upcoming legislative session. And I don't know about all of you, but we are already pretty busy, thanks in part to the special session, which I'll talk a little about, that kind of accelerated our usual time frame, but meeting with key legislators to hear about what they're planning for the upcoming session and talking to them about business previews or business issues that are important to all of us, and going to a lot of stakeholder meetings on those draft bills. So lots of information to discuss and share already, believe it or not. A quick word about C3. Allison did a great job of giving the big picture overview. As she noted, the Colorado Competitive Council is exclusively focused on pro-business public policy at the state level. So we don't play in local government affairs. We don't do federal. We are only focused on policy in Colorado at the state capitol. So we do that in 3 different ways. Most of our work happens at the state capitol during the session. C3 has the largest pro-business lobby team in the state. So we've got a number of good folks who have long and varied experience in various areas of policy that help us communicate our positions on those issues to our legislators. We have a group called our Legal Affairs Council that is about 15 pro bono attorneys who specialize in different policy areas that are on call for us throughout the session to take a look at bills where we need a little more professional help in terms of the legalities of the issue. And then the second thing that we focus on is assisting folks like all of you. So at the local level, part of the reason that C3 was founded was to make sure that chambers and EDCs across the state have a forum to share information, and we provide resources to chambers and EDCs to help you do what you're doing in the policy work. Having been a chamber person myself prior to taking this job, I know how busy you are, how many topics and things that you have to cover every day. And so we want to make sure that we are helping you to amplify your voice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this presentation. And then we have, oh, and I should mention, Chris Romer from the Vail Valley Partnership is the chairperson of our steering committee, which is where all those chambers and EDCs come together to discuss legislative issues twice a month during the session and then monthly during the interim. So if you're not a part of that group, please email me. I'd love to get you involved. It's a really great information sharing forum for all of us. And then we have a signature program that is really cool that we do in the interim. We call them business base camps. Every year we choose a cohort of bipartisan legislators, typically new, and we invite them to take us on tours of their districts. So it's a great opportunity for us to pile onto a bus in our jeans, less formal than at the Capitol, and learn about the regional issues that are important to the different regions of our state and be able to talk about them in more depth than we do during the crunch time that is the state legislative session. It's also a great opportunity to build relationships with lawmakers and among businesses and community leaders. So moving on to our business climate, I just wanted to say a word about why we do all of this policy work before I get into the how and the who and all of that good stuff. On your screen is the CNBC business rankings, and it's just one of many rankings that various publications and businesses and outlets do. You all keep track of those too as well, but I'm just highlighting this one because we have dropped in our rankings across the nation for our business climate and our business friendliness. And so that's something that's very concerning to all of us that work in this space and something we need to keep an eye on. And you'll notice we certainly have some strengths across these categories, but the two where we're really getting dinged is the cost of doing business and the cost of living. And of course, that doesn't come as a surprise, but when it's getting highlighted on a national scale, you know, that's a red flag and something that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds as we go into the legislative session so that we can communicate that to our legislators and communicate what policies are contributing to that, either in a positive way or a negative way. It's a little context there. And then moving on to the political makeup and who is making the decisions. As a reminder, 2 years ago, we had an election where the numbers really changed, and instead of a split legislature where we had one party controlling one chamber and the other party controlling the other, we now see a very strong Democratic majority, an almost veto-proof majority in the House. And you can see from the graphic there, the color is a powerful illustration of that. And, you know, we much prefer to work in a split chambers because there's a lot more collaboration that happens. It has to. In order to get a bill across the finish line, you need to work with your colleagues across the aisle and hear their ideas and have some measure of compromise in a bill that's going to make it through both houses controlled by different parties. And in an environment like this, there are a lot of folks who feel like they've been given a mandate to push things through without getting other perspectives. And I want to be clear, that's not a partisan statement. That's a process statement. If these pie charts were more dominantly red, I'd be making the same complaint, and it would just look a little different in terms of the bills that we saw. Leadership is almost the same as last year's session, but there is one change, as you can see highlighted there in yellow, and that is the Senate Majority Leader is different because Dominic Moreno went to work for the new mayor of Denver, leaving a vacancy. And so Senator Robert Rodriguez, who was previously chair of the Business Committee, will now be serving as Senate Majority Leader. And the reason that that matters is not just because that's like the Real Housewives of the state capitol for political junkies like me, but of course, one of the most important jobs of the Majority Leader is committee assignments. And as you all know, that is where the majority of the work on a given policy or bill proposal is done. And as one of my lobby team observed last session, every issue, with one exception, that the business community cared about came down to one vote in one committee. So we are working on very thin margins, and one legislator who it is more or less business friendly or shares our perspective can make a huge difference. And Senator Rodriguez has made some changes to a number of committees, including the senator that he chose to replace himself on the business committee is not particularly business friendly. So that should make for some interesting dynamics at the Capitol this year. And just to further illustrate that point, this is some information from a group called Fiscal Note. They do a lot of data collection. What you're looking at here is their rankings of states of how effective we are in passing legislation as a percentage of bills passed to introduced. And we are at the very top of the list there. So if something is introduced at the Gold Dome, it has a darn good chance of passing. And that means that a majority of the work that we are all doing is probably in refining whatever is initially introduced. So amendments, small changes, and again, that is where those committee members are so key in doing that work. And a couple of your legislators are great examples of how that worked last session. Senator Dylan Roberts from Vail, the Speaker of the House, Julie McCluskey, also were very key in making some key changes to legislation that was high profile. So let's talk about some of the factors that will affect the sorts of policies that we will see. Of course, we just had a 4-day special session following the failure of Prop HH. The governor called that to make some quick and immediate changes to property tax policies just for our coming year, because there are a series of deadlines that happen this month involving our county assessors and bills being sent out and rates being set for next year's bills and budgets. So there was a short time frame in which the legislature could do this work. And if this is a preview of the sort of dynamics that we will see at the regular session, we have some cause for concern. The special session was marked by a lot of tension, a lot of partisan fighting, filibustering, and procedural issues. And the atmosphere down there in the building was not particularly collaborative, which is disappointing. And to see that before we're even getting into those long nights is a little concerning. The results of that session, which again are just for next year, this is a short-term solution, is that residential property taxes will be cut. The assessment rate was reduced from 6.675, if I remember correctly, to 6.66%. I'm questioning my numbers there, but you get the scale, and that results in $434 million in reduced property taxes. In terms of the average individual bill, it's not a lot. So I think that Coloradans will be looking for more in the regular session. Lawmakers also made some changes to how much of a property's value would be exempt from property taxes. They increased the earned income credit as a tax relief measure and flatten Tabor refunds so that everyone will receive the same amount versus in past years, refunds have been given based on income brackets and likely sales tax paid. The state also put some money into rental assistance. So there's an existing state program that will get another $30 million to assist renters. This was one of the criticisms of Prop HH, was that it did not give any relief to the 30% of Coloradans who put a roof over their heads by renting, not by owning. And then we had a little bonus item. One of these things does not belong, and that was taking advantage of some federal dollars that became available to support a summer meals program for low-income children. That one obviously did not fit with the property tax theme, but was time sensitive, and so the legislature took care of that as well. Then there's a task force that will be appointed on December 4th. And the particulars of who gets to appoint them were spelled out in the bill that was passed. And that group will meet between mid-December and March of next year to discuss longer-term solutions. What is our plan for alleviating property tax in the long term? We really hope that commercial will be included as part of that conversation. It was not in the special session. Some relief was contemplated in Prop HH. And that group needs to be done with its work by mid-March so that there is time for the legislature to run legislation coming out of what that task force recommends. And then we have two ballot measures also looming in the background that may be on our November ballot. One is backed by Michael Fields and his group Advance Colorado. He collected signatures last summer, and it proposes a 4% cap on property tax increases. And then a second measure was filed just a couple of weeks ago by Colorado Concern, who's also been doing a lot of work on this topic on behalf of the business community. And their proposal would reset valuations to 2020 levels and then cap increases at 2.5% a year. And then if you sold your home, that amount would reset to current values. Looks very much like Prop 13 in California, if any of you are familiar with that measure. Questions or comments on that before I move on?
It doesn't look like anyone has submitted at this point.
All right, then I'll talk a little about the budget. The governor released his budget proposal, and that gives us some clues about the sorts of legislation that we will see. This is the first year since COVID where we have a normal budget environment. And what I mean by that is the ARPA dollars, the federal assistance is all spent. It's gone. The deadlines have passed. And so we are going back to an environment in which our state taxes are the only things that we get to spend. The forecast that came out just recently says that we will probably have $1.2 billion more in general fund dollars to spend in the next fiscal year. So that means we are in a Tabor refund situation. But as I mentioned in the special session, those earned income tax credits will reduce the amount available. And then the governor is proposing converting $30 million in housing grants to tax credits. And that's something that we commonly see in a Tabor refund situation because it reduces that Tabor refund amount. Despite that $1.2 billion in extra funding, when you take out things like inflation and increased spending in programs that are mandatory, that leaves somewhere between 15 and 23 million for new programs that the legislature will get to decide how to spend. During the interim, those committees came up with proposed bills that they will send to their colleagues in the regular session that totaled up $2 billion. So they've got some prioritizing and some decision making to do to get that number down to what they have to spend. The governor has identified his priorities as housing. Of course, this was something that he really prioritized last session as well. K through 12 funding, public safety, and making Colorado one of the 10 safest states in the country. Healthcare and behavioral care, a lot of dollars going to new or existing workforce programs, and then continuing to put money away for a rainy day in our state reserve fund. And then in terms of some of those dynamics that are going to affect how our decision makers interact with each other. You may recall from last session, 2 lawmakers sued their own parties over alleged violations of open records laws and transparent open meetings laws. And while those were resolved, there's still a lot of sensitivities around how that happened and the decisions that were made. And so how those conversations happen now during the session are probably going to look a little bit different. People are being much more careful about the meetings that they're having and if they have been properly noticed to the public. I mentioned earlier that things will probably change under a new Senate Majority Leader, and we've already seen those changes that I mentioned to how he's structuring the committees, who's on them, how many people are on them, and so forth. And then there are other factors like the governor's housing package last year that caused a lot of tension with local communities and organizations like the Colorado Municipal League and Colorado Counties, Inc. Those disputes are still lingering and are already starting to crop up in discussions. So moving into some specific legislation, I'm going to cover some things that we know are coming in some topical buckets here. And I'll start with labor and employment, which of course is kind of our bread and butter as business advocates. Some of the things that we know are coming include wage theft legislation. And I just got an update about this yesterday. Proponents would like to take a model that was passed at the city and county of Denver and go further and make contractors liable for subcontractors' violations of wage theft laws and a number of other provisions that are concerning to businesses, particularly in the construction industry, which really is the target of this legislation. But we anticipate that the proponents will be advocating for those changes to apply to all businesses, all industries in the future. Drug testing on the job is something that we have seen in past sessions. Now that marijuana is legal in the state of Colorado, there are some legislators who feel that prohibiting the use of that substance or having that substance in your bloodstream or drug testing on the job doesn't make a lot of sense anymore and feel that it is discriminatory in some way. So we're likely to see that legislation again this year, prohibiting drug testing. In the past, we've also seen some prohibitions on non-compete and non-disclosure agreements, which some lawmakers feel are unfair restrictions on workers. We also saw last session 6 different bills that attempted to take funds from the unemployment insurance fund and send them to other programs or new programs. And most notable of those 6 bills was one that would propose a dependent allowance be paid from those funds. So right now, as you know, those funds are paid by employers as an insurance policy for their employees, that if their employees become unemployed, then they can get those funds back. It's an insurance policy. This proposal would have additional payments go to any unemployed worker who has dependents, children or others. Last year, we were able to kill that proposal, thanks in part to the governor's opposition to that. But we'll see what happens this year. We're also expecting some bills that have to do with gig workers. Again, we see these things multiple years, and this one's no exception. Last year, there was some legislation aimed at TNCs and DNCs, so people like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, and changing how they treat their contract employees. That will be coming back. AI, of course, is a hot topic on so many fronts, and we're expecting some legislation in how that is used on hiring processes. I suspect you all followed very closely, as did we, the Fair Workweek legislation. We may see that return in a different format. And then hearing that weight may be designated as a protected class, just as other protected classes have discrimination in the workplace protections in Colorado. Questions on those? All right, I'll move on to the next topic, and that's housing. Of course, this is critical to our competitiveness as a state. There's a tie to workforce, their ability to live where they work, and our housing prices. I saw a stat recently that said in the last 2 years, the average Colorado home has gone up 40%. So that's obviously not sustainable. And there's a lot of attention on how we do something about those numbers. So we're expecting the same policies that the governor proposed last year in his big omnibus bill, Senate Bill 213, pieced out as separate bills. And they're going to focus on a couple of things. Wider use and permissibility of accessory dwelling units in residential zones, emphasizing transit-oriented development and putting more funding toward emphasizing that. That's an effort to increase density, especially around transit sites. And then looking at zoning policy and how multifamily in particular can be more easy to implement in single-family zones. And then a number of other housing-related bills. Our friends in the Home Builders Association are looking at 3 different proposals on how we might unlog jam. Is that a verb, unlog jam? Our construction litigation policies that we have on the books in Colorado that have virtually shut down our condo construction market. Then we'll see a number of proposals related to rentals like we did last session, including another attempt at so-called just cause eviction, which says that if a landlord is going to either evict or not renew the lease for a tenant, they must show so-called just cause, and those allowable reasons are spelled out in the bill. And then in some cases, they would have to provide relocation costs to that renter, possibly up to 3 months of the rent. And then some other policies you can see there on the screen have to do with housing. And one that I've already heard from a lot of you in the mountain communities about is the proposal to designate short-term rentals as commercial properties and tax them accordingly. That's an idea that's been floated before, and Senator Chris Hansen from Denver has said that he will bring a bill on that subject this session. Next on the list there is healthcare. Healthcare has had a target on its back for a couple of sessions as legislators attempt to bring down costs of health insurance and healthcare and pharmaceutical care. The most concerning of these proposals is that first one there. The Colorado Trial Attorneys Association is proposing either at the legislature or the ballot. I'm not sure which or both proposals they've settled on yet. Removing the caps on medical malpractice suits. And our members in healthcare are very concerned about what that will do to healthcare costs if lawsuits could have no cap on the dollar amounts that could be awarded. The single-payer healthcare study will come back. We'll probably see some additional mandatory coverage bills, including for weight loss drugs. Mental health is also a big focus at the legislature, so we'll see some proposals around that. And then our hospitals are bringing a bill proactively that will attempt to help them protect their workers against violence, a really sad trend that we have seen start during COVID and unfortunately continue even to present day. And then last on my list here, I think last on my list, is environmental policies. And this too has been a real focus of our legislators, particularly in the last session, that making sure that we're meeting our environmental goals in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, aiming toward being carbon neutral, improving our air quality, and so forth. And there was a committee that has been meeting over the interim. I think they still have a meeting or two on their schedule that's looking at ozone in particular. Here where I am in the Denver metro region, the air quality has been out of compliance with EPA regulations for a very long time. And despite passing all sorts of air quality regulations, we are not going to be in compliance anytime soon. So a lot of legislators are focused on how we can make improvements to the air quality in Denver, and those regulations are spilling over into other areas of the state. There are also some legislators look at prohibiting natural gas in new homes and businesses because they see that as a fuel that's not clean enough for our energy goals. There's a proposal that is going to propose the state take over permitting for rural renewable energy projects. I practiced saying that so that I wouldn't stumble on rural renewable energy projects instead of having the locals do that. So I imagine we're going to have yet another fight between local and state control on that one. The state's billing it as something that would speed up permitting for those projects, but I don't think we have any assurances that the state can do it faster than local governments can. As you know, employee trip reduction mandates have come up every year for a number of years, haven't been successful yet, but given that focus on air quality, I imagine we'll see that again this year. Some good news, met with the sponsor of the Community Choice Energy Bill, and he said he is not going to be running that bill, so that's off the list. And then grants for electric garden equipment. They're surprisingly bad actors in our air quality picture. And so we have some legislators who would like to provide some incentives for folks to switch from gas powered to electric garden equipment. And that's an improvement. In the past, it has not been an incentive-based approach, which we always prefer. It's been more of a mandated approach. So glad to see a little change in approach there. Questions or comments on any of that legislation? This is, believe it or not an exhaustive list. So there may be something that you're particularly concerned about that I haven't mentioned, and I'd love to hear about that, or if you have questions about any of the things that I've mentioned. All right, hearing crickets, I will move on to, as we think about I've told you a lot about what we expect is coming. And so the logical next question then is, what do we do about it? And I think, oops, I left that slide out. It's critical that we do a great job of storytelling as the business community. And that's something I think we have a lot of room for improvement on. And typically in committee hearings, proponents of a lot of these policies that we don't like come with really compelling personal stories. And, folks may even be crying in their testimony. And we as the business community often have a tendency to show up and say, well, we have our spreadsheets and this is expensive. And there's just a real mismatch there in terms of philosophy, and our messages are not resonating. The speaker has told us directly that when we talk about money, we don't sound like we care about the people involved and the people who are affected by these policies. And on the flip side of that, we have seen how effective we can be when we can do the storytelling piece. The Fair Workweek bill last session was killed not just by one vote in the House, but by 2 or 3 votes. I can't remember now. And that's significant. And it happened because chambers around the state, restaurants around the state reached out to their legislators and wrote to them to say how this would affect them. All sorts of folks showed up in the committee hearing and talked about how restaurant workers, retail workers, and business owners work together to make schedules work for everyone. And it turned the tide in that committee and changed the outcome on the bill. So this is a place where you as local chambers can be, and local businesses can be especially effective. And we want to be here to help you to do all of that. So as you can see on the screen there, I've got a list of some of the things that C3 does to assist you in doing the great work that you're doing in your local communities, and making sure that you are informed on the particulars of these bills, the schedules of when they'll be heard. We provide a legislative directory to help you reach out to your legislators very easily. We have a grassroots advocacy tool that can help you get those emails to your legislators. And we are happy to assist with getting you in touch with legislators, putting together your day at the Capitol, basically anything that you need in terms of advocating for your businesses and your local communities. We are here to help. So please reach out and take us up on it. That is all I prepared today. happy to take questions if you have them. Would love to hear your reactions to the things that we've talked about today, things you're concerned about, or anything else policy related that's on your mind.
Well, Rachel, it's hard to have a lot of questions when you're that comprehensive. So thank you so much for what you've prepared. I am going to keep that Q&A open so that people can type in there now that they've seen the full presentation. As you said, one of the big things we heard a lot about just recently was that Senate Committee Bill 6 with reverting residential taxes to commercial tax rates on short-term rentals. And you said you are anticipating someone bringing that into the full legislative session. I'm wondering if you can just start by giving us a slightly deeper dive. Will it look a lot like that committee bill? Is that where the kind of amendments and small tweaks are gonna start happening?
Yes, exactly, Allison. It will be that committee bill. And it's unfortunate that it made it out of the interim committee, because any bill that does, of course, gets kind of priority in the regular session. And the fact that it's Senate Bill 6, as you noted, also shows that that has been designated as a priority by somebody. I do think, though, that bill is going to have a hard time for a variety of reasons. One of them being how much you mountain communities have already spoken up and said, this is not going to work how you think it's going to work. I think the intention of the bill is in part to make sure that housing that would go to locals is not being eaten up for tourists instead. And Chris Romer has been very articulate on this topic. And he at least has said that doesn't think that that's the case for a variety of reasons. I'd love to hear your perspective as well. So that's going to be a factor. Another factor, I think, is the county assessors hate it, because it's an administrative nightmare for them to have to figure out how to designate a property as part-time commercial and part-time residential. And so I think that legislators will be sensitive to their concerns about how they even make this work, and how much it will cost local communities to administer it. So this is one I would encourage you all to speak up on, because I do think that there's a shot at either killing the bill outright or making some significant changes.
And those resources you provided us with some of that, once the legislative session starts, scheduling and what's being talked about, when we can go to your website to see when those public comment opportunities are.
Yes, and if you are interested in our weekly newsletter, there's always a calendar section in the newsletter that highlights key bills and when they will be in committee to help you keep track of all of that.
A couple more questions trickling in, one specific to the topic we're on. So I think we'll go to that first. As far as the reclassification, I think one thing probably that you're hearing is that the mountain communities almost blanket in the last 2 years just addresses themselves, right, individually on the local level. So should something come through that essentially is double dipping or taxing on top of a new STR tax that was just implemented, then what is the ramifications of that? What would happen on the local level? Would you expect lots of extractions of those or that double tax now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't really know the answer to how that would shake out. But I imagine that local officials will be concerned about those funding sources, and that too will sway committee votes. That's a great point.
What do you know about potential legislation on property insurance and what that might look like? The question here, they already have issues getting quotes for properties, I think, with that anticipated change.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that is something that I think is going to be one of C3's top 3 priorities, because we too are hearing a lot from brokers, from HOAs, from communities, from individuals, that they can't get insurance, that the rates have gone through the roof. We have some insurance companies that are investors in C3 who have said kind of quietly, they will renew existing customers, but they aren't taking on new ones in Colorado because of our cost environment, our regulatory environment, how at risk we are for things like hail and wildfire. Last session, we saw a bill called the FAIR Plan that attempted to make sort of a safety net for folks who had trouble getting insurance and was particularly aimed at wildfire areas. The legislator who sponsored it represents people who were affected by the Marshall Fire. And I'm hearing a lot of talk about implementing some sort of state-funded insurer of last resort, similar to what's been done in places like California and Florida. And when my members are looking at those places, they don't think that that's working out particularly well for insurance companies or for people who are being insured. So I think we're on the cusp of a real crisis in Colorado if we don't figure out some solutions to that and do it pretty quickly. I don't know what those solutions are yet. I do think, in answer to the question, that we'll probably see some proposals from legislators on what they think that might be. And I think that it would behoove the business community to come up with what we think would be effective sooner rather than later. Because as you know, a lot of times if you wait for the legislature to solve a problem for you, businesses often don't like what they come up with. And so it's better if we can come up with something ourselves and present it to legislators. Keep in mind, most of our legislators have never run a business. And so they don't understand some of those dynamics and how some of these things will play out when they're operationalized. And that's where all of us can be a resource. So that's a long way of saying, yes, I think there will be legislation. And we are working on putting together a working group of sorts that would try and come up with some proactive solutions. One of my lobbyists and I also met just a couple of weeks ago with Representative Andrew Basenecker and Representative Judy Amable, both of whom have spent a lot of time thinking about insurance, and Representative Kyle Brown, who previously worked for the State Department of Insurance, and they were very enthusiastic about bringing together some heads in the industry to come up with some solutions that will work for Colorado. So I'm optimistic that we can come up with something, but a little nervous about the time frame and the urgency of the issue.
Thanks for addressing that, Rachel. You said it's probably in your top 3 for C3 this year. Did you mention 1 or 2? Do you want to bring up some of your other 2 focuses?
I didn't. Thanks for asking. So the other 2 would be, we've noticed a trend toward a much more litigious working environment in Colorado. A number of pieces of legislation. We actually worked with the Common Sense Institute to do a report just recently on this issue. And they identified 43 new regulations in, I believe, 2 years that all increased private rights of action, increased business liability for things like attorney's fees, made treble damages possible, or took issues that previously had to be resolved administratively, which is cheaper and faster for everyone involved, and allowed them to go straight to court, which is typically longer and more expensive for resolution for everyone involved. So we're very concerned about that trend. Our friends in various EDCs around the state have heard from companies that they work with that those companies are starting to make a note of that, because obviously risk management is huge. And if Colorado's risk is becoming higher and those costs are becoming higher, then that's the sort of thing that might cause a company to expand elsewhere, or to take their business elsewhere. And obviously that's not something that we want to happen. And of course, as I mentioned, if people are bringing legitimate suits and issues forward, we also want those to be resolved quickly, and not tied up in court for a long period of time. So this is a trend that we don't think benefits consumers or businesses. This is another one that I'm not sure yet what the solution is, but it's something that we're putting some focus on. We met with the Attorney General's office to talk about some of this with them, and they're concerned about it in terms of state costs as well. So I think there's some opportunity there for some synergy around that issue. And then the third one on the list is workers' compensation. And there's some good news on this one. Last year, some proponents wanted to remove both the caps and the schedule when it comes to workers' comp awards. So the schedule says things like, if you lose an arm in an injury on the job, you receive a $5,000 award. I don't think anyone can argue that that is reasonable. And so there's absolutely some room for all of us to work together on updating those standards and making them more appropriate. But getting rid of the schedule and the caps would blow open the costs. And there's a nonpartisan national organization that did an actuarial study on this proposal, and it would have resulted in a 20% average increase across the board in Colorado in terms of workers' comp rates. So obviously, if that's an average for industries like construction, recreation, skiing, manufacturing, anything where there's a higher chance of injury because it's a more physical job, the rates would have been even higher. So again, we already have an inflation issue, or have had an inflation issue. Our cost of living was one of the things we got dinged on in that study I shared earlier. Those are costs that we want to make sure are going to not harm our business climate. So we spent a lot of time in meetings last year, rolling up our sleeves and talking about the details. And eventually we're able to convince the sponsor to not introduce the bill at all. And when we met with him earlier in the month, he said he won't be introducing it this year either. So some good news for now, but I think this is an issue we're going to have to continue to work on in the future. So 3 very sexy subjects, as you can tell.
Well, then finally, I know in the mountain communities and rural at all, workforce is such a big issue. So I was excited to see that you said that will be one of the governor's priorities. I don't know if you have any further insights on workforce support, extra funding or new programs, especially as it may help those smaller communities.
Yes, there are a couple of programs that you may be familiar with because the governor had previously launched them, and pulling up some information now as we speak on the details. One of them is expanding some existing apprenticeship programs and putting more dollars to back those. I'm a terrible multitasker here.
No,
Sorry,
go ahead, and I'll do a last pitch for additional questions in that Q&A if anyone wants to throw those in while you look. Yeah.
All right, here it is. So expanding apprenticeships is getting $30 million in refundable tax credits and $2 million in grants. That will support new apprenticeship programs and help to defray the cost of hiring apprentices. And then there's some dollars going to programs that would align community college and Department of Labor and Employment training and apprenticeships. A program called Opportunity Now is getting another $25 million. That helps to support upskilling workers, particularly in construction and manufacturing sectors. And then there's an increase in dollars in the governor's budget for support for higher education institutions, which thanks to some unique budget pressures in Colorado, have had less and less state funding, as you know, and that has increased tuition rates. So these particular dollars are going to help keep tuition rates low for Colorado students going to those state institutions. They're also sending some dollars to direct financial aid to students for tuition and fees to help support students directly. And then one more here, the Colorado Development Incentive Program that would address high demand from schools for career development in high schools, and some work-based learning programs in high schools as well, to help those students graduate with skills that they can go get a job in right away at a higher wage. And then there are some dollars here as well for a mentorship program for teachers.
Thank you for pulling that up. We have another question then. Some mountain communities over the last year have been faced with challenges of Venezuelan refugees who have relocated here. Are you aware of any thing coming up on the state level that would address either short or long-term needs of incidents such as that?
Yes, I did just hear something about this. I'm glad you brought this up. The Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, CDLE, is working on some additional funding that would help support efforts related to that topic. And that's another one where I will try and find some details here and give you a little more specifics.
And again, while you are researching, I'll let our attendees know. This is, of course, being recorded. I think look to your respective chamber for our communications, newsletters, social, however you hear about that. But the link to share with your colleagues or watch again will be available shortly afterwards.
All right, Allison, I found it.
Great.
They are asking for a little over $150,000 and a person and a half to help support the Office of New Americans that would go after additional grants, coordinate with other entities in this space, and identify opportunities for migrant career path enhancement.
Fascinating. What an interesting place for that to be addressed.
And I think they're very open to input. So if you have some ideas on what would better support those efforts in the mountain community specifically, I would encourage you to reach out to CDLE and make those suggestions.
Wonderful. Anybody else from the participants who tuned in? Again, thank you so much for taking your time to get informed. Rachel, that was such an incredible, comprehensive preview. So I feel like those of us who get to watch this are now a little more prepared for what may be coming and how it may affect our members and our businesses. Definitely seems like one of the years to keep our eye on the day-to-day more than maybe typical.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me. It's always helpful to me to hear the sorts of things that are on your minds and what maybe is a little different in the mountain regions.
Certainly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.